Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. Today I will be talking about 10 albums that you should hear. There's no rhyme or reason in the selection I've made. These are just CDs that I've been listening to fairly recently and thought I'd like to share with you. Right, first up we have Curt Boettcher and Misty Mirage. He made his name in the 1960s as the producer on the Association's first album, which included their hit single Along Comes Mary. He was also a performer in his own right, playing in the studio bands Sagittarius and the Millennium. These are previously unreleased tracks from 1966 to 1969, and they were eventually released in 2000 on the Poptones label, which was the label set up by Alan McGee after Creation Records had folded. There's a couple of tracks on here I particularly like. Tumbling, Tumbleweed, which has great Beach Boys, Harry Nilsson style vocals, and it's got very distinctive pedal steel guitar, which is supplied by Red Rhodes, who worked with Michael Nesmith for a number of years in the First National Band and beyond. Moving along, we've got Caravan and their second album from 1970, If I Could Do It All Over Again, I'd Do It All Over You. Unlike a lot of progressive rock, it hasn't really dated, and I think it's down to the fact that they concentrated on melodies, and on this album it's got a real live in the studio feel which works well, and I particularly like the keyboards of David Sinclair. The most famous track on here, probably the most famous Caravan track of all, is For Richard, which has appeared in their live set ever since. In fact, there's a version of Caravan that's still touring today, and they're hoping to play a few dates here in the UK later this year. Next up, it's the self-titled album by David Gilmour. This was recorded after Pink Floyd had recorded the album Animals. And what makes it particularly interesting for me is that the musicians that appear on this, Rick Wills and Willie Wilson, had worked with David Gilmour before. Before Gilmour had joined Pink Floyd in 1967, he'd had his own band called Jokers Wild, and in the final lineup it was Rick Wills, Willie Wilson and David Gilmour. So it was great that he thought enough about that band to want to get together with them again. Bassist Rick Wills had played in Cochise in the 1970s and would go on to play with Foreigner. He was also in a version of the Small Faces when they reformed in the late 70s. And the drummer, Willie Wilson, brilliant drummer, had played in Sutherland Brothers and Quiver. It's not a brilliant album, but what I like is the stripped back production. There's no overproduction like you get in Pink Floyd. The track that most resembles Pink Floyd is the single There's No Way Out of Here, which has some female backing vocals on it, a nice guitar solo, and it's actually a cover version from a band called Unicorn, but they did have connections to David Gilmour. I think he discovered the band and he produced their album from 1976, which had the original version of this song on. Next up we've got Gentle Giant, Octopus. This was their, I think it was their third album, and the band consists of the three Shulman brothers, who are all multi-instrumentalists and joined by some other musicians. The Shulman brothers had started out as Simon Dupree and the Big Sound, who had quite a big hit here in the UK with Kites in 1967. Like Caravan, the musicianship doesn't get in the way of good melodies, and They're a band I've always liked, and I think they were at their peak on this album. Right, this is an interesting album called Carnival of Sound by Jan and Dean. And Jan Berry was a studio whiz, and this is their equivalent of Smile by the Beach Boys, because sadly the recordings were never released at the time and weren't released until Reiner put them out in 2010. The reason for them not being released was the tragic car accident that Jan Berry was involved in shortly after recording started. He was in a coma for about 3 months and suffered brain injuries, and he had to learn to speak again. So it was several months later before he went back in the studio to do some more work on this album. It was painfully slow progress, and eventually the record company pulled the plug on the recordings. But Andrew Sandoval, who's been involved in lots of other reissue projects, including with the Beach Boys, has helped put together this album, and it includes mono versions and stereo versions of the tracks. And it's considering the situation in which it was recorded, it's a really fun album and shows the humour that was always there in Jan and Dean. Maybe not a classic album, but certainly well worth picking up if you can find it. Next up we've got Old Number One by Guy Clark. I've loved this album since it first came out in 1975. It's the quality of the songs which make it such a perfect record. The really well-known tracks on here are Desperados, Waiting for the Train, LA Freeway, but a lot of the other tracks are just fantastic. There's not a bad song on the album. I particularly like the backing vocals, which are supplied by Emmylou Harris. Her voice really gels well with his gruff, rough-hewn vocals. Very good album. Next up we've got Al Stewart, Year of the Cat. He'd had a cult following for many years for his folk rock epic songs, usually with history background to them. And what he did on this album was he tweaked that formula, so you still get some history songs which he was famed for, such as Lord Grenville and On the Border, but the song structures are a lot tighter, and he's got some great musicians on here backing him, including Tim Rennick, who was the guitarist in Sutherland Brothers and Quiver, and went on to work with Roger Waters and many other artists in the 1980s and beyond. Next we have a compilation album which came out on Ace originally in the 1970s called Another Saturday Night, and it's a compilation of Cajun music from South Louisiana, or Cajun swamp pop, rhythm and blues. It must have been a revelation for those people that first heard this in the mid-70s as they started to discover the music that was coming out of the American roots at that time. Artists on here include Tommy McLean, Belton Richard, Cookie and His Cupcakes, Johnny Allen with Promised Land, and it's an album that's really, really interesting. Next up we've got the Dictators, and this was their debut album Go Girl Crazy, which came out in 1975. There's so much to love about this album. The songwriter Andy Chernoff writes really humorous lyrics, which also make you feel nostalgic for a more innocent age. You've got a great frontman in handsome Dick Manitoba, and just a brilliant lead guitarist in Ross the Boss. Every track on this album has its charms. There's a cover version of I Got You Babe, and also a cover version of California Sun, which the Ramones covered a couple of years later. They were just a band slightly out of time. Their sort of New York proto-punk attitude and humour came into its own a couple of years later with some of the bands that came out of CBGBs, and they should have been bigger than they were, but sadly it wasn't to be. I was lucky enough actually to see the Dictators play a couple of times in small clubs. This was in later years, but they still had Ross the Boss and handsome Dick Manitoba fronting the band, and if you get a chance to see them, just go, because it's just good time, classic garage rock and roll. And finally, Guns N' Roses, the Spaghetti Incident. I can't say I'm a massive fan of Guns N' Roses, but this album I just love. The choice of the material, it's mainly punk rock songs, so it's great that a band like Guns N' Roses would cover UK Subs track Down on the Farm, and amongst the other tracks you've got a Steve Jones song, Black Leather, Johnny Thunders, You Can't Put Your Arms Around a Memory, and I would rate this as the best album that they did. But I'm not a particular fan of Guns N' Roses, so I know it's not respected by too many critics. But what I do like is the live in the studio sound that they get. Matt Sorum's drums just really cut through like John Bonham. Slash's guitar crunches in all the right places, and Axl Rose just proves what a great vocalist he was, and he could have made it in any era of music. That becomes clear on the very first track, which is a track that the Skyliners recorded in 1958 called Since I Don't Have You, and his vocals are just pitch perfect on this track. So that's the selection of 10. Assuming people like this video, I will continue to post some more